everything's cleared out, our first step, like I mentioned, since we're going to not paint these walls, is we're actually going to cover these with this 9-foot plastic using the masking machine. So we just want to start right up here and kind of get us right in that corner there. And we're just going to start working our way around the room here. And just kind of pressing that in. We'll come back later to actually press that in a little bit harder before we caulk that edge. But for this, we're just trying to get that up there. And so once you get to this corner here, you're actually going to want to pull a little bit of excess off, just so you can kind of press that into the corner and that doesn't pull out and allow you to not kind of get all the way into that edge. Like it did right there. Now, since we've got this shower here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to cut masking here so we can bring it down here, and then we're going to do another little run here just for this corner. And we're just going to take our masking machine, just make sure to line up this edge so you don't have a weird drop off. You just kind of want to really make sure those edges line up. And like I said earlier, pull that excess and then press this into the corner. And we're just going to pull here. And just remember, when you're cutting this, always make sure to grab right here, kind of angle your wrist in like that, and just pull that along that blade to get a nice clean cut. So the next thing you want to do, we've got this up here. Since we do have a textured wall, we're just going to want to take a finger here and just really run along that tape and make sure we're really pressing down into that texture, just to make sure we don't get any bleed through with the paint. Now that we have that pressed in, the great thing about this 9-foot plastic that makes it super convenient is we're just going to grab this from underneath, and it's actually folded on itself. So we're just going to go around the room and we're going to pull this down. Since we use the 9-foot plastic, we should have coverage in most rooms all the way to the floor. And another convenient thing about this plastic is, being the length that it is, a lot of times for these vanities and toilets and stuff like that, just anything that's along the wall there, you're also going to get covered as well. So we got this 9-foot plastic pulled down. As you can see, the great thing about this is we've got our entire tub covered here. We've got our entire toilet, vanity, everything's covered up. And you know, I really can't think of an easier way that you could get all this covered and still have that nice clean line at the top. So next step we're going to do is we're going to take our fast dry caulking with our caulking here, and we're just going to run a small bead of caulking along the edge of that tape. Now, as you get each section done, you're just going to want to take your finger and you basically want to wipe as much of that caulking as you can. And another thing convenient about this plastic is you can just wipe any excess off right there. And I always like to give it just one more wipe just to make sure we don't have a lot on the edge of that tape. That's the main thing that you're trying to do here, is we're just trying to get a thin bead of caulking that just sits right on the edge of that tape line to prevent any bleed through of our ceiling paint onto the wall. And we're just going to continue that process around the room until we're finished. So the last step we're going to do in prepping this room is we're actually going to get a little bit of paper just to cover any odds and ends that we didn't get with the plastic. Just a quick tip on how to put some paper and tape on this masking machine for those of you that haven't done it before. You've got this little dowel here. We're just going to slide our paper onto there, and then you're going to want to take your tape here, and you actually want to go under this little thing, go over, and then I like to just pick that up with my finger, lay that flat, and then you're just going to roll a little bit past that. That's going to press that tape down on, and this is going to keep that tape staying straight on here. Then I usually just like to rip a little bit of excess off just so I have a nice clean edge. So one thing to keep in mind when you're painting a ceiling is whatever you don't cover is most likely going to get paint on it. there's always speckles and little drops that come off the roller. So we're going to take some paper and we're just going to cover up any miscellaneous items that our plastic didn't get. And then after that, we're going to cover the entire floor with the drop cloth. So real quick before we start painting, just wanted to touch on sheen. For a lot of other surfaces, you can really use any kind of sheen that you'd like, but for a ceiling, I really only recommend using a flat sheen. Now this is for two reasons. The first being that you're not going to have as many brush strokes or imperfections show up in it, and then the second being that the way light hits a ceiling is a lot different than any other surface in your house. And really any imperfection in the drywall, anything like that is really going to show up unless you're using that flat sheen. And another thing to remember is before you go to purchase this paint, make sure to check at your local paint store. A lot of times they offer paint products that are made specifically for ceilings, and they're going to be at a lot less of a cost than a traditional wall or a trim paint. So the next step is we're going to actually get some paint on the wall here. What I like to do first is to go around and get all these edges done before we actually get the roller out. So we'll actually be doing 2 coats on those before we ever start rolling it all. And the main reason I like to do that, it's not going to matter so much with this flat paint, but if you're doing a wall or using maybe an eggshell sheen or something like that, you're definitely going to want to do this first. It's just going to end up with a lot better looking finish. Whereas you do run the risk if you do the cuts on the edges last, that those will really stand out compared to where you rolled. Another tip or mistake that I kind of see newer people make when they're getting into this is you don't need to brush out 6 inches onto the wall. You can actually get pretty close to the wall with that roller, especially since we're masked off on all our walls. We're not going to have to worry about getting it on there. So I say just do about a brush width out, and that should be good. So one of the advantages of this tape caulking here is we don't have to get too close and really try to edge that in great. Just the only thing you want to be careful of is get plenty of paint over that edge. That doesn't really matter, but if you see there's kind of a buildup, you want to kind of swipe that just so we don't have a super thick layer of paint over that edge. And since we're going to be doing 2 coats on this ceiling, that's not going to make too much difference for coverage anyways. Alright, so we got our first coat dried up. We're going to go ahead and put a second coat on all this before we get to rolling. So our next step here is we're actually going to get this roller full of paint, and that's one tip I can give you too that I see a lot of beginning painters make. The big mistake is not getting enough paint in the roller. So really load that thing up with paint. Don't worry about any drips. That's why we covered everything in here. And then we're just going to take this up here, and we're going to kind of lay a little angle just to get some paint on the wall. And then we're going to come back here, and we're going to work our way into the corner here, and we're just going to start working our way back and forth. And since we kind of have fairly short strokes here, we're going to be able to get quite a bit out of this. But after you get to about that point there, you're going to want to go ahead and dip and get some more paint in your roller. Since this is a flat sheen of paint that we're using, we're not going to have to worry too much about laying it off or really getting a lot of roller marks in there. But one thing I will recommend that I always like to do is, basically we got our paint line here. I've got a roller full of paint. I always like to start right over here, kind of just do a diagonal line to kind of lay some of that excess paint off the roller off. And then we're going to meet up and we're going to overlap about halfway with where we were at. And then we're just going to kind of continue to go along and overlapping basically half or even, a quarter of the way of what we've already rolled. Making sure to press that in since this is a textured ceiling. You're really going to want to use some pressure when you're pushing this on. Another thing I would recommend when painting everything with texture like this is you really want to get the right kind of roller nap. So I really like to use a 3/4 inch roller nap. You could maybe get away with a 1/2 inch, but I would not go any lower than that. And really what that's describing is that's just the width of the roller that you're going to have that's actually going to hold paint. So the wider it is, 3/4 to 1/2 to 1 inch, the more it's actually going to soak in and get paint into every little nook and cranny of that texture. And one other thing I could mention is, if you notice how I have my roller, I've got the outside of that arm here always to the right of what hasn't been painted yet. So what I like to do is kind of keep a little bit more pressure on this end, and then it's going to leave this end to kind of smooth everything out as you're going along. Whereas if you really take this and press that end along, you're going to get runs in that. Whereas if you keep the pressure on the arm side of that or towards where you're going, you're not going to run into that as much. And so there's our first coat. We're just going to let that dry up to the touch, and then we'll put the second and final coat on that.